A vacation with friends or family is a time for relaxation and enjoyment, but for some unlucky people, it can unexpectedly take a turn for the worse. Whether you're swimming in the ocean and unexpectedly cross paths with a man-eating shark, or hiking in the wilderness and accidentally startle a mother bear and her cubs, your peaceful holiday can quickly turn into a life-or-death situation. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times people have been fatally attacked by wild animals while on vacation. Welcome to Final Affliction. To some, a cruise is a peak of travel comfort and the ultimate experience that everyone should have. With the chance to see the world and bring all of your home comforts along for the ride, with karaoke, cocktails, and shows available every day. You are treated like a VIP every minute that you're on board and can easily see some new countries and cultures along the way. It can be the ideal experience, but the problem on a cruise ship is when it comes to safety. While the locals know all the problems and the things to look out for in their town, the constant flow of tourists are oblivious. This can lead to people getting lost, eating the wrong food, or, in the worst cases, death. If there have been sharks in the area recently, the locals won't swim there because they would have heard through word of mouth, a luxury that is not afforded to most travelers. Unfortunately, this is what happened to Chris Davies on his tour to Sydney, when he came closer to the local wildlife than he ever could have wished. 59-year-old Chris Davies had been enjoying his cruise so far. He had boarded in Melbourne onto the Grand Princess cruise liner with 3,000 other people as they explored the Fiji Islands and headed to New Caledonia, an island off of Australia. He had enjoyed the last 9 days immensely, soaking up the sun and relaxation that came with a 5-star holiday. He was a very active man, regularly competing in triathlons for years and finding new ways to keep healthy as he headed towards retirement. He had represented Australia several times at World Championship events and was well known in his hometown as a very devoted and determined man. Back home, he had a wife and 3 children whom he loved dearly, and although he was enjoying his holiday, he was excited to return home to see them again. Before he was able to travel full-time, he was still working as a software programming consultant in Sydney, a job that took up a great deal of his time, but it made his relaxation time even more precious. He was very excited for his next destination, where he hoped to swim in the clear waters and snorkel along the coral reefs to see what the underwater world would hold for him. Unbeknownst to him, there was much more waiting under those waves than just colorful fish and coral. Once the ship reached the shore, Chris quickly disembarked and went to explore the beaches close to the port. He always enjoyed getting his bearings before he headed off on his adventures. It made him feel much safer rather than aimlessly wandering around. He managed to find a local restaurant where he could try some of the local food and then went to the Chateau Royal Beach, with amazing views across the whole bay. As he arrived, the sun was gradually getting lower and there were lots of people taking advantage of the cooler temperature of the evening by swimming in the sea. Chris decided he would join them and have a late swim before he headed back to the boat for dinner. He set his things down and walked out into the water, choosing to stay close to the pontoon as there were more fish for him to see there. He swam around the jetty for a little while, diving down to watch the fish, but remaining close enough to shore that he could still see his things. He was wary of someone stealing his bag as he was in a new area and didn't know what the people were like. He was, however, worrying about the wrong thing. There was nothing on land that would cause him harm. It was the animal that was swimming right towards him that he would never see coming. At 4 p.m., Chris thought about returning to the shore as he was getting tired from his day of traveling. As he was debating his next plan, he was pulled under the waves with a strong grip on his leg. He was dragged further from the shore, and he could feel the water getting colder, so he knew that he was somehow in deeper water. The grip on his leg loosened, but he wasn't safe yet. As he surfaced, He looked around for what had just attacked him and saw a 4-meter tiger shark charging towards him. He put his hands out in front of him in defense, hoping to push the shark away from him or at least provide some kind of protective barrier for the rest of his body. There was no protection to be given. The shark approached quickly, and as Chris tried to push it away, the fish bit off both of his hands in one swift motion. The pain was indescribable, and he screamed out for help as the animal continued to bite and shake him. There was nothing he could have done to defend himself, and now, with blood pouring from his hands and thigh, he began to feel weak and nauseous. The shark pulled him under the waves once again and shook him violently, his blood filling the water and fueling the shark to become even more violent. His screams had attracted attention from the shore, and he could hear them organizing his rescue. But deep down, he knew it would be too late, as he felt the shark bite into his body once again. The pain was minimal as he began to lose consciousness. From the shore, lifeguards heard Chris's screams and knew something was wrong. A shark attack had happened just a couple weeks previous, so they had been on high alert for another, and it seemed today was that day. They ran to their jet skis and charged into the water to where they could see Chris surrounded in blood. He wasn't moving, but they didn't want to pass any judgment on his condition until they pulled him from the water. When they brought him back to shore, a number of civilians swarmed around the scene to administer first aid while they waited for the emergency services to arrive. They were surprised that he was even still alive, but they intended to keep it that way. They were shocked to see the man without any hands, as well as a bite along his thigh that was nearly 40 centimeters long. The idea that they were swimming next to such a massive predator sent shivers down their spines. His blood was still openly flowing from his wounds and soaking deep into the sand. They didn't even think it was possible for a man to bleed so much, but they knew that from the injuries he had just sustained, it was unlikely that he would survive. Even if he did, he would have horrifying disfigurements that would change the rest of his life. He would need help doing regular activities and would most likely never compete as a triathlete again. Even so, they put all of their efforts into saving the man bleeding in front of them, hoping against hope that they would keep him alive. They continued with their CPR efforts for 40 minutes, desperately hoping that they would be able to save him, but unfortunately, it was too late. Chris Davies died from his extensive injuries at around 5 p.m. After Chris's body was collected, an investigation was launched into how this could have happened. The beach was not supposed to have been reopened so soon after the last attack, as they hadn't been able to prove that the beach was safe yet. Sadly for the tourists, they had no idea about this and were not stopped from going into the water, which is why Chris was able to be attacked. Locals also knew that the jetty where he was swimming was popular with sharks, as staff members from the hotel would throw food in for the fish to show their guests. Following the attack, they closed the beach again to ensure that no one would be able to put themselves at risk, and a shark culling was put into effect. Fishermen began their search and managed to catch 2 sharks that they believe were most likely to be the culprits of the attack. During the necropsy of the animals, one shark was found to have the left and right hands of Chris Davies within its stomach, along with fragments of his swimwear. This proved without a doubt that they had caught the animal responsible, and so they told the public that the killer shark was dead. Upon further inspection, they also believed that the same shark was most likely the one that attacked the woman a few weeks previously, meaning it had gotten a taste for human flesh. Luckily for everyone else who would travel to the beach later, the threat of meeting their final affliction by the jaws of a man-eating shark was gone.
Matt and Melissa Graves from Elkhorn, Nebraska, had decided to take their children on the holiday of a lifetime. After months of excitement building in the household, the vacation had finally arrived, and they headed to Florida in June 2016. Their destination? Disney World, Orlando. After experiencing some of the very best rides in the world, the family headed down to the relative quiet of the Seven Seas Lagoon one evening. Seven Seas was a man-made lagoon that offered boating and fishing experiences. There were a number of people walking along the shores, running on the beaches, and fishing from a couple of boats. Although it was late for the children, around 8:30 p.m., Matt and Melissa decided that it was their holidays, that they would stay up this once. On the shores of the lake, there was an outdoor movie experience for them to enjoy. It was something that they had never done before. Matt and Melissa sat and watched the movie, but as the children were so young, they weren't interested in what was on the big screen. Instead, they played on the beach, digging up the sand and splashing in the water. Matt and Melissa had packed with them a bucket and spade. They pulled them out of their bag and handed them to the children. 2-year-old Lane jumped up and down excitedly, toddling onto the sand that ran down to the edge of the lake. He grabbed the bucket from his older sister and began filling it up with sand. His parents helped him turn the bucket over, tap it 3 times, and then lift it up to reveal a sandcastle. Lane squealed in delight, and the family did this over and over. After some considerable time playing in the sand, Matt and Melissa decided that it was getting late and time to go. When they got up to leave, Lane cried out in defiance. His parents looked at each other. They decided to give in to their toddler's demands and stay a little longer. What harm could it do? When it came time to dig the trench around the mound of sandcastles, Lane picked up the bucket once more and ran to the lake. Wading into the ankle-deep water, Matt and Melissa watched on as he splashed into the shallows. He patted his feet up and down, looking down as his toes sank into the muddy, sandy substrate. Then, the 2-year-old bent over and scooped up a bucket of water to take back to the moat they were building. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a huge commotion. In an instant, their happy, playful toddler, who was giggling and grinning, was snatched by an alligator just feet from his family. Matt leapt up from the sand. He jumped onto the alligator, wrestling it into the water. The alligator had its jaws wrapped around Lane's head. Matt thrust his hand into the alligator's mouth. He tried desperately to pry them open, but the great beast thrashed around, throwing Matt off of its back. In the frantic commotion, Matt claims that another alligator went for him in a frenzied attack. It is unclear whether the minor injuries he suffered were from the alligator that took Lane or from a second one joining in on the attack. No sooner than it had happened, the alligator vanished, sinking beneath the water's surface. In a moment of shock and terror, the family were forced to watch their young son being dragged underwater by the terrifying 7-foot beast. In those first heart-stopping seconds, Matt and Melissa ran into the water where their boy had been dragged under. A lifeguard was alerted and came running to the scene. The water was murky and brown. Matt dived under the water again and again, scrambling about with his hands to feel for any sign of their son. He couldn't see a thing. He couldn't feel anything. Every time he reached out, all he did was grab fistfuls of the squelchy, muddy lake's bottom. As he came up for air, he saw Melissa frantically rushing through the shallows, screaming and yelling. Lane made for easy prey. He was only 37 inches tall and weighed 30 pounds. Standing defenseless in the shallows, he was an easy target. Alligators are ambush hunters. They are apex predators in their environment. They typically take fish, turtles, muskrats, birds, and deer. Unlike their crocodile cousins, they are typically less aggressive, and it is rare for them to attack humans. But when they do, they rely on the element of surprise and their bite force. The pressure from an alligator's bite is comparable in pressure to the weight of a small pickup truck. Onlookers at the lagoon could do nothing but watch in absolute horror, hoping upon hope that the boy would somehow resurface. But with each passing minute, their hopes were dashed. Emergency services arrived on the scene within minutes. Jumping into a boat, they scoured the lake. A massive search operation involving over 50 officers was initiated, and devastatingly, Orange County divers came across Lane the following afternoon, 17 hours after the attack. He was lying limp and lifeless in just 6 feet of water. Submerged, he had been left by the alligator only yards from where he had been taken. Heartbreakingly, he was just feet from where Matt and Melissa had frantically searched for him, but the muddy waters churned up by the commotion in the water made it impossible to see below the surface. Lane's body was pulled from the water, carried back to the beach and into the arms of his devastated mother. Rescuers pronounced him dead at the scene. Wildlife officers concluded that although Lane had suffered trauma to his head and neck, he had drowned when the alligator had dragged him into the water. There were only a couple of puncture wounds where the alligator had grabbed him. His body had been untouched after the attack. It is likely that the action of Matt jumping onto the alligator and attempting to free his son from its powerful grip had startled the predator, and after dragging the boy underwater, it had then let go. Lake Kissimmee near Orlando has the second biggest populations of alligators in Florida. It is home to almost 2,000. Their large numbers force some individuals to look elsewhere for food and territory to avoid competition. Some make it into recreational lakes frequented by locals and tourists alike. Following the devastating incident, officers captured and euthanized 6 alligators from the lagoon. When the alligators were examined, their stomachs were empty, suggesting that the reptiles inhabiting the Disney lagoon were hungry. The attack on Lane had been predatory. His actions had not provoked the alligator in any way. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Since June 2016, Disney World has erected warning signs along the edges of the lagoon, warning tourists of the presence of alligators. Although alligator attacks in Florida are rare, they do occur and they have devastating consequences. Lane was simply enjoying his vacation with the people who loved him most in the world. The alligator was simply taking advantage of an opportunity, one that resulted in Lane Graves' terrifying final affliction.
Kimon Bisogno and Diego Mauled met 13 years ago on a beach in Ibiza. It was love at first sight. Kimon, a South African native, spoke English, and Diego could only speak Spanish. But even though they could barely understand each other, they made it their mission to learn how to communicate. And what better way to do that than over their shared love of cooking? After Kimon returned to South Africa, the two remained in touch, with Kimon learning to speak a serviceable Spanish, and Diego took classes that helped him become fluent in English. Diego was the one to make the big move across the seas, moving to one of South Africa's biggest capital cities, Cape Town. Together, they opened their little corner pizzeria, Fernando's Pizza. In between busy shifts and a rich social life, they carved out the time to run a soup kitchen that served the poverty-stricken communities across the city. And Kimon worked closely with the Rainbow House organization to fight homelessness in Cape Town. To say that the two were loved in the community would be an understatement. Kimon and Diego were loved by the rich, by the poor, and everyone in between. Almost everyone knew them by name, and if there was an event, whether that be charitable or a sporting event, they were almost always counted on the guest list. Together, they had a daughter, Luna, and Kimon, now in her mid-30s, was planning on trying for just one more baby before she reached her 40s. But the COVID-19 pandemic threw a wrench in their future plans. Together, the happy little family braved the storm that hit the world, and once it was safe for business to commence as usual, they hit the ground running. Like everyone else, they had their plates full trying to salvage their business, to reopen their soup kitchens, and now that Luna was starting kindergarten, the school runs and sporting events took up a big chunk of their time too. 2022 was an exhausting year, and the family decided that they'd take a short break in September, just as spring came to southern Africa. The big holiday season would start in December, and with all the preparation that they needed to put in before that time, this would be the last chance that they'd get to catch some of the new warmth that came with spring, and the rush to make up for lost time hit them in full force. Plettenberg Bay was 300 kilometers away, but the 4-hour drive went by quickly enough. The warm weather brought a handful of out-of-season holiday goers and surfers to the resort town. During peak season, the place is packed to the brim, more so than the other coastal hotspots. But in September, it was just full enough to add a little excitement to a weekend away, but not so much that the overcrowded streets and beaches became claustrophobic. The family spent their first afternoon unpacking their luggage at the resort that they booked into, and they took Luna out to play in the shallow pools with her fishing net. After they'd caught a handful of tiny fish and picked up a shiny shell or two for Luna's collection, Diego and Kimon picked up some takeout on their way back to their hotel. Luna was fast asleep by the time they pulled the car in, and Diego carried his daughter to her bed. They decided to let her sleep. She'd like her chicken nuggets just as much for breakfast in the morning. Saturday dawned even brighter than the day before, and all of them were itching to get back to the beach. Diego offered to stay behind so that Luna could finish her nuggets and have that bath that she'd missed out on the night before. So Kimon headed off to the beach, along with the other early risers at the resort, planning on meeting them there later. The resort's beach was just a 10-minute walk from their chalet, and Kimon didn't even bother to take her phone or any belongings besides her towel with her. She and Diego fully expected to see each other again within the hour. September in the area also brings its fair share of juvenile sea lions that have been weaned from their mothers and are finally old enough to venture out into the water on their own. Inevitably, this influx of the inexperienced prey also brings in the predators. Just 3 months ago, there had been a fatal attack on a human from a great white right on the stretch of beach where Kimon was swimming. The warning signs and red flags were long gone from the sands now, and the country had all but forgotten about the tragic event. Besides attacks being incredibly rare, the oceans also have nets spun around popular swimming destinations to keep the bigger fish out, and a slew of observation vessels that are constantly scanning the surface for sightings. How the 14-foot great white managed to slip through the nets and the searchers' sharp eyes is still a mystery. It literally came out of nowhere. Kimon was amongst 20 or so other swimmers, and there were 4 surfers in the distance riding the rather low waves. There were at least 10 people who were deeper in the water than she was. Kimon was only standing waist deep in, watching the riders attempt to catch a decent wave. The only explanation is that the shark came from as deep as the water allowed it to go, and it applied the usual tactic when storming into a colony of sea lions. Great whites hurl themselves into the middle of the pack and bite down on the one who just happens to be closest to its jaws at the time. Whatever the case, one moment Kimon was standing with her back to the sand, with Diego and Luna walking towards her, and the next, an enormous gray beast reared out of the water directly in front of her. Its mouth was already open and geared to strike before it even broke the surface. Kimon didn't stand a chance. There was no warning, no time to even think of turning to flee. The predator sank its teeth into her, engulfing Kimon's upper body whole. Only her head and legs remained outside its jaw. Diego, who'd had his eyes on Kimon when it happened, grabbed Luna and stuffed her face into his chest to spare her the gruesome sight that was playing out before them. The group around Kimon scattered, knocking each other out of the way to reach their children and to make it out to safety. The shark took Kimon like she weighed nothing, viciously throwing her from side to side. One older gentleman launched himself at the screaming woman. What he planned to do about the dire situation, no one knows, but it didn't matter. The shark's head slammed into him, sending him flying several feet away. His equally gray-haired wife grabbed him and pulled him out. As the water turned red and the people fled, several people called emergency services, and Diego could only stand watching as the love of his life was being ripped to shreds. Before the last of the hysterical swimmers were even out of the water, Kimon stopped screaming, but that didn't stop the animal from tearing at her. It let go, swimming off with a chunk torn out of her abdomen. After making a wide loop, just long enough to swallow, it struck Kimon's lifeless body again, this time making away with a piece of her left thigh. Diego couldn't take it anymore. He shoved Luna into the arms of the elderly woman who'd helped her husband out of harm's way. Diego was about to enter the water himself. It didn't matter that she was already dead, or that he stood a good chance of dying himself if he dared to go in, as long as he could get her out. The old man saw what he was about to do, and despite his bruised ribs and his age, he grabbed Diego and held him back, yelling at him that his little girl shouldn't be orphaned completely. Diego didn't hear a word of it, and he continued to struggle to get out of the surprisingly strong old man's grasp. The other swimmers came in, huddling around Diego. They kept him from going into the surf towards certain death, and that's where rescuers found them just 7 minutes after the attack occurred, with Diego weeping in the center and the ravaged body of Kimon floating in the shallows. The shark had disappeared, satisfied with what it could get from Kimon, and it was never seen again. The poorest streets of Cape Town went into a deep mourning. The homeless and the impoverished went on a spree to steal flowers from homeowners' gardens in the more affluent parts of the city. And now, even 2 years later, Diego and Luna still find a bouquet of flowers most days of the week when they go in to open the store for the day, a constant reminder of Kimon and the day she met her terrifying final affliction.